Welcome to the Philosophical Odysseys podcast.
Glad to be here for this one.
Today, we are embarking on a mission to explore Alain de Botton's brilliant book, The Consolations of Philosophy.
Right, using a pretty extensive stack of translated excerpts as our guide today.
Exactly. And I want you, the listener, to consider this deep dive a custom-tailored survival toolkit for life's inevitable frustrations.
It really is.
Whether you are prepping for a highly stressful meeting, navigating a complicated relationship, or just trying to process the sheer bewildering complexity of being a human being, we have got you covered today.
We're going to look at how 6 historical heavyweights provide highly practical, sometimes shockingly therapeutic answers to specific human ailments.
Things like unpopularity,
Property,
inadequacy.
and heartbreak, of course.
Alain de Botton really acts as our curator for this journey, doesn't he?
He does. And he approaches these texts in a way that radically departs from standard academic readings. He was born in Switzerland in 1969, currently residing in London, and he doesn't treat Socrates, Epicurus, Seneca, Montaigne, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche merely as abstract thinkers.
Right, not just guys to be dissected in some dusty university seminar.
Exactly. He treats them as philosophical medics. He extracts the functional, applicable wisdom from their vast bodies of work and applies it directly to the most common, painful experiences we face today.
Because the premise here is that philosophy wasn't originally designed to be an obscure intellectual game, right?
No, not at all. It was designed to offer tangible consolation for the literal pain of existence.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if we're going to treat philosophy as a medicine for our daily lives, we have to start with a symptom that almost everyone listening has suffered from at some point.
The acute pain of being unpopular.
Yes. And to explore this, we turn to a man who literally died for his unpopular beliefs. Born in Athens in 469 BC. But before we get to his public trial, the text highlights his remarkably turbulent private life.
Specifically, his marriage.
Right, his marriage to Xanthippe. She was infamous in Athens for her incredibly bad temper, which begs the question, why would a man dedicated to peace of mind choose to marry and stay with someone so famously difficult?
Well, the historical anecdotes surrounding their marriage provide a perfect microcosm of his broader philosophy. When asked why he endured her constant berating, Socrates reportedly made a fascinating comparison to horsemanship.
Horsemanship.
Yeah, he suggested that just as ambitious horse trainers do not seek out the most docile, easily broken horses to master their craft.
They want the challenging ones.
Right, they want the wildest, most spirited animals. He said he needed Xanthippe. He viewed the daily friction, the arguments, and the sheer difficulty of his domestic life as an essential training ground.
Wow.
It was a rigorous daily exercise in maintaining his philosophical calm, his patience, and his commitment to rational response over emotional reaction.
That reframes domestic bliss entirely. He was essentially using interpersonal conflict as resistance training for his mind.
That's a great way to put it.
But how does that domestic resilience scale up to his philosophy regarding society at large? Because the text notes that Socrates identified a fatal flaw in human nature.
The herd mentality.
Exactly, our overwhelming tendency to conform to the majority.
He observed that when we face a dominant societal opinion, our first instinct is self-doubt. We possess an internal monologue that argues, if the majority of my peers or my society have decided that this is the correct way to live, who am I to question it?
We implicitly trust the sheer volume of voices.
We do. We assume that society couldn't possibly have been making a massive fundamental error for centuries, and we certainly assume we couldn't be the sole individual perceptive enough to spot it.
So we just suppress our dissenting questions.
We silence our intuition, and we fall in line with the herd, not because we have reasoned our way there, but because the alternative,
Standing alone,
is psychologically terrifying.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because standing alone in Athens wasn't just psychologically terrifying. It was literally a matter of life and death.
Oh, absolutely.
To understand the magnitude of Socrates' refusal to conform, we really need to understand the actual mechanics of the Athenian judicial system that eventually condemned him, because this was not a modern courtroom setup.
Not even close. The Athenian judicial system was fundamentally an exercise in mass opinion. We're looking at a system where juries, known as the dicasteria, consisted of anywhere from 200 to 2,500 male citizens.
Up to 2,500 people on a single jury.
Yes. There was no impartial judge presiding over constitutional law. There were no complex rules of evidence like we have today. The trial was essentially a giant rhetorical contest,
So the accuser spoke, the defendant spoke.
and then the jury immediately voted, quite literally by a show of hands or by dropping tokens into a jar.
That's wild. So truth in the system was literally just decided by a head count.
Whoever possessed the ability to sway the emotions of the crowd, whoever had the most hands raised in their favor at the end of the day, was deemed objectively correct. The majority opinion was legally and culturally equated with the truth.
But Socrates looked at this system, a system that defined his entire civilization and completely rejected its premise. He argued that truth is not a popularity contest.
Right.
How did he actually convince anyone that a system relying on the collective vote of thousands of citizens was flawed?
What's fascinating here is how he utilized the concept of craftsmanship to dismantle their reliance on majority rule. He urged his fellow citizens to look at the tradesmen around them.
Like the potters and shoemakers.
Exactly. He'd say, if you require a sturdy pair of shoes, you do not gather 2,000 random citizens in the agora and ask them to vote on how the leather should be cut and stitched.
Right, because that would be a disaster.
You go to a single trained cobbler. If you need a clay pot, you go to a potter who has dedicated years to mastering the specific techniques, temperatures, and materials required for that craft. You trust the single expert over the ignorant majority.
And he applied that exact same logic to the concept of living a good life.
Precisely. He posed a devastating question. He asked if we refuse to trust intuition or a majority vote for the relatively simple task of building a ship or throwing a pot, why do we assume that the immensely complex, infinitely more difficult task of living a moral, just, and good life can be done purely by copying the crowd?
Why do we assume that morality requires no special instruction?
Yes, and that whatever the majority happens to be doing is naturally correct. Socrates insisted that what society calls common sense is frequently just centuries of accumulated intellectual confusion.
He demanded that we apply the same rigorous logical standards to our values that we apply to our trades.
So he is establishing a framework where truth is determined by logical consistency, not by a show of hands. If a statement, a belief, or an accusation cannot be logically disproved, it holds weight.
But if it is based on flawed assumptions or contradictions,
It is false, even if 2,500 people are screaming it at you.
let's apply the Socratic method to modern life for a second. Specifically, the phenomenon of online mobs or, cancel culture.
It's incredibly relevant.
You post a controversial opinion or make a misstep at your company, and suddenly there is a tidal wave of criticism directed at you. The sheer volume is designed to completely overwhelm your sense of self.
And the Socratic framework acts as an impermeable shield in exactly those moments. Socrates teaches us to forcefully disconnect the number of our critics from the validity of their criticism.
The volume of the attack is entirely irrelevant.
What matters, the only thing that matters, is how those critics arrived at their conclusions. If 1,000 people hurl insults at you, but their reasoning is rooted in unexamined biases, logical fallacies, or incomplete information, then those insults possess no actual weight.
They are the equivalent of a drunk, unskilled potter trying to sell you a cracked vase.
Perfect analogy. You are under no obligation to buy it simply because he is shouting loudly. Their disapproval reflects a cognitive error on their part, not a reflection of your fundamental worth.
For you, the listener, navigating the politics of a workplace or the pressure of a social circle, this is a radical shift in perspective. When you face criticism at work, do you cry because you need external validation?
Socrates is whispering across 2.5 millennia, telling you that true self-respect does not derive from the applause of the room. It derives from the unshakable foundation of your own reasoning.
If you have systematically and logically thought through your position, and your critics are merely reacting emotionally or protecting the status quo, you maintain the intellectual high ground.
The math of the crowd does not alter the geometry of the truth.
I love that phrase. The math of the crowd doesn't alter the geometry of the truth. It is a liberating realization, but it clearly demands immense courage.
It really does. Socrates held that line of logical consistency all the way to his execution by hemlock. He did not hate the Athenians who condemned him. He simply recognized the fatal flaws in their reasoning and refused to internalize their verdict.
He achieved total intellectual independence, but as de Botton notes, unpopularity is only one source of our anxieties. We are also deeply, relentlessly plagued by material concerns.
Which brings us to our next philosopher.
So, if Socrates teaches us not to care about the number of our critics, Epicurus teaches us not to care about the number in our bank accounts. We're moving to the consolation for not having enough money.
Epicurus, born in 341 BC on the island of Samos, is perhaps one of the most misunderstood figures in Western philosophy. We need to immediately correct the massive historical distortion surrounding his name.
Because when you hear the word Epicurean today, the immediate association is with exorbitant luxury.
Exactly. We picture Michelin star restaurants, decadent multi-course meals, rare wines, and a life dedicated to excessive sensory indulgence.
We picture the guy whose entire life revolves around finding the perfect truffle. But the text explicitly states this modern definition is entirely backwards.
It is a complete inversion of his actual teachings. Epicurus did famously state, "Pleasure is the beginning and goal of a happy life."
Which sounds like he wants the truffle.
It does, but his definition of what constitutes actual pleasure was incredibly austere. He argued that the ultimate human pleasure is simply the absence of pain in the body and the absence of anxiety in the soul.
The baseline.
Just the baseline. He maintained that a diet consisting of plain bread and water could deliver as much genuine pleasure as a lavish, expensive banquet, provided you are eating that bread when you are genuinely, physically hungry.
Yeah.
The baseline of a peaceful, unbothered mind was his ultimate goal.
To help his followers achieve this anxiety-free state, he developed an incredibly practical diagnostic tool, which we can think of as the matrix of needs.
Yes, he categorized all human desires, everything we want, buy, or strive for, into three distinct buckets.
Let's go through them. Bucket number 1, natural and necessary.
These are the absolute non-negotiables for human survival and happiness. On the physical side, it includes basic food, shelter, and clothing to protect us from the elements.
But crucially, Epicurus identified psychological needs that belong in this essential category too, right?
Yes, what he called the big three: friendship, freedom, and thought.
Okay, we'll come back to those. Bucket number 2.
Yeah.
Natural, but unnecessary.
These are desires that stem from our natural bodily needs but have been escalated beyond necessity.
Like a massive, opulent mansion instead of a simple house.
Or a luxury bathhouse instead of basic hygiene. A giant, elaborate feast instead of a nutritious meal. They are nice to have, but you do not need them to avoid pain or anxiety.
And finally, bucket number 3. Unnatural and unnecessary.
These are entirely manufactured by society. They include the lust for fame, the pursuit of immense political power, or the desire for absolute social dominance. They are impossible to fully satisfy and serve only to generate endless anxiety.
Let's focus deeply on the psychological needs in that first bucket, the big 3 necessary ingredients for happiness: friendship, freedom, and thought. Epicurus prioritized these above almost every other human endeavor.
He really did.
Starting with friendship, he actually laid down a rule that you should never eat alone. He stated that eating without a friend is the life of a lion or a wolf. Why was he so adamant about dining companions?
Because he understood the profound psychological function that true friendship serves. Friends serve as a mirror that confirms our core identity.
What do you mean by that?
When you're operating in the broader society, you're constantly being judged by external, often superficial metrics: your job title, your income bracket, your social influence.
Yeah.
But when you sit down with a true friend, all of that hierarchy evaporates. They accept you outside of the social ranking system. In a world that is perpetually categorizing and evaluating us, a friend provides a safe harbor where you are permitted to exist simply as yourself, without pretense or performance.
That makes perfect sense. The second essential ingredient is freedom, and the text details how Epicurus and his followers actually took this concept to an extreme.
They didn't just write about freedom. They enacted it by buying a plot of land outside Athens, known as the Garden, to live a simple communal life.
But stepping away from the economic center of Athens means stepping away from wealth.
Yeah.
How did they justify that trade-off?
They recognized that the commercial rat race of Athens, while potentially lucrative, was fundamentally toxic to their peace of mind. To earn that money, they had to endure the humiliation of answering to capricious, demanding employers, competing ruthlessly with peers, and constantly worrying about their professional standing.
So by moving to the Garden, they consciously accepted that they would have significantly less money and fewer material goods.
But the trade-off was absolute autonomy. They bought their freedom from the corporate grind with the currency of simplicity. They grew their own food, shared resources, and liberated themselves from the anxiety of the economic ladder.
And the third ingredient is thought. Epicurus believed that unexamined anxiety is the primary destroyer of our peace. How did he utilize thought as a practical tool in the Garden?
He treated philosophy as a form of therapy. He encouraged his followers to actively externalize their anxieties. When they felt a vague sense of dread, They were instructed to write it down, to discuss it openly, and to subject it to rigorous, rational analysis.
Give me an example of how that works.
Let's take the ultimate human anxiety, the fear of death. By thinking about death logically rather than emotionally, Epicurus reasoned that death is simply the total cessation of consciousness,
A state of non-existence.
identical to the time before we were born. Since you will not be conscious to experience death, it cannot cause you pain. Therefore, the fear of death is irrational. Thought cures the mind of its manufactured terrors, just as medicine cures the body of illness.
So, synthesizing those three ingredients, Epicurus arrives at a devastatingly clear formula for assessing our lives.
The formula is quite simple. If you possess immense wealth, but you are isolated without true friends, trapped in a job that strips you of your freedom, and tormented by unexamined anxieties, your money cannot and will not make you happy. You lack the foundational ingredients.
Conversely, if you are materially poor but your life is rich with deep friendships, a strong sense of autonomy, and a clear, reflective mind, your poverty will not make you unhappy. You possess the actual, functional mechanics of joy.
De Botton highlights a historical event that illustrates this philosophy in action perfectly. Let's look at the story of Diogenes of Inolanda.
Okay, set the scene for us.
We're fast-forwarding to roughly 120 A.D. Diogenes is an incredibly wealthy man living in a bustling, highly commercial market town in what is now modern-day Turkey. He looks around at his fellow citizens and sees a population obsessed with commerce, stressed out, constantly shopping, and trying to cure their internal miseries by acquiring luxury goods.
That's pretty familiar.
It does. Recognizing the futility of this, he uses his massive wealth to do something extraordinary. He constructs a colossal stone wall right in the epicenter of the town market. This wall is roughly 80 meters long and 4 meters high.
I am trying to picture this. He basically built a giant, ancient billboard in the middle of a shopping mall. What was the purpose of this structure?
He inscribed this massive wall with Epicurean slogans and philosophical arguments. Imagine walking through a busy, high-end shopping district today, surrounded by advertisements telling you that buying a certain car or a specific perfume will make you complete.
And right in the middle of it all is an 80-meter wall broadcasting the opposite message.
Exactly. The wall warned shoppers. Luxury food and drink will not protect you from illness. And natural wealth is strictly limited, but the desires of the mind are endless.
He was attempting to publicly break the hypnotic spell of consumerism.
He wanted to physically interrupt the shoppers and force them to realize that the expensive cloaks and rare spices they were agonizing over would never cure the emptiness in their souls.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it asks a remarkably pointed question of our own modern behavior. For you, the listener, navigating a world of one-click purchasing and targeted advertising, Epicurus demands that you interrogate your impulses. Think about your online shopping cart right now.
Are you buying a high-end cashmere sweater because your body genuinely requires protection from the cold, a natural and necessary desire? Or, if you are brutally honest with yourself, are you secretly hoping that luxurious garment will act as a substitute for the emotional warmth of a friendship you are currently lacking?
Are you purchasing an expensive watch to tell time? Or are you attempting to purchase the respect and authority that you feel you lack in your career? We constantly try to solve psychological deficits with material acquisitions.
However, the text also presents a vital, challenging counter-argument to the Epicurean ideal, articulated by the Roman poet and philosopher Lucretius.
Right, because not everyone agreed with sitting in a garden forever.
Lucretius observed that while Epicurus is entirely correct about the mechanics of achieving peace of mind, there is a profound civilizational cost to that peace.
The cost of progress.
Exactly. He pointed out that humanity's monumental achievements are not born from contentment. If early humans didn't possess an endless, anxious, aching desire for more, for better tools, wider territories, deeper knowledge, we would never have advanced.
If everyone was perfectly content sitting in a communal garden, eating barley cakes and chatting with friends, we would never have built ships capable of crossing oceans.
We would never have mapped the stars or developed modern medicine. Lucretius argues that human progress is essentially fueled by our profound dissatisfaction. We permanently trade our Epicurean peace of mind for technological and cultural advancement.
That is a staggering trade-off to consider. We are faced with a choice between being peaceful but static, or being perpetually anxious but advanced. Regardless of which path we choose, one thing is certain. Having unfulfilled desires leads to deep, agonizing frustration. And no one understood the psychological architecture of human frustration better than Seneca.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, unfulfilled desires lead to deep frustration. And our next guide lived and breathed that frustration.
Let's move to the consolation for frustration. We are talking about Seneca, the Stoic philosopher who died in 65 AD.
To understand his philosophy, we must understand his environment. He navigated the incredibly treacherous, high-stakes political waters of the Roman Empire, eventually serving as a tutor and primary advisor to the Emperor Nero.
Which is a famously stable and relaxing job.
Completely the opposite. This was an environment where unimaginable wealth and sudden violent death were constant, unpredictable possibilities. In this volatile setting, Seneca developed a brilliant thesis regarding our psychological pain.
His main thesis is that frustration does not arise simply because bad things happen. Frustration occurs exclusively when our internal desires crash into the unbreakable wall of external reality.
The wall of reality. Let's examine anger, which is the most explosive, destructive form of frustration we experience. When we get angry, we usually frame it as an uncontrollable physiological passion. The red mist descends.
We lose our car keys when we are late, or we hit a massive traffic jam and we simply explode. We yell, we pound the steering wheel, and later we apologize by saying, "I'm sorry, I just lost my mind for a second, the anger took over." We blame it on an irrational external force hijacking our brains.
But Seneca completely rejected that excuse. He argued that anger is not an uncontrollable physical reflex. It is a fundamental intellectual error. And the root of this error is a state of dangerous, unexamined optimism.
Dangerous optimism, that sounds almost contradictory.
Seneca observed that we get angry because we secretly harbor a deep-seated belief, a subconscious contract we believe we have signed with the universe that stipulates life will generally be fair, easy, and cooperative.
So when you lose your keys, you yell not because the keys are lost, but because your highly optimistic worldview genuinely did not account for the possibility of misplaced items.
Exactly. When you hit traffic, you rage because your internal optimistic map of reality did not include the possibility of other human beings obstructing your path.
Yeah.
Our anger is directly proportional to our expectations.
So Seneca is essentially arguing that if you want to eliminate anger from your life, you have to systematically eradicate your dangerous optimism. You have to adjust your expectations of reality. And the Roman culture had a perfect visual representation for the unpredictability of reality.
The goddess Fortuna.
Right.
The Romans literally prayed to Fortuna, the goddess of fortune and personification of luck. In her artistic depictions, she is a study in terrifying duality. In one hand, she holds a cornucopia, a horn of plenty, representing her ability to unexpectedly shower you with immense wealth, passionate love, perfect health, and professional success.
Which is the side everyone wants.
But in her other hand, she holds a ship's rudder. This represents her absolute power to abruptly steer your destiny directly into a jagged rock. She can plunge you into poverty, illness, or disgrace without warning and without reason. She is entirely fickle, owing you nothing.
Recognizing the supreme power of Fortuna meant accepting that catastrophe is not an anomaly. It is a constant hovering possibility. To combat our dangerous optimism and prepare for Fortuna's rudder, Seneca proposed a daily, rigorous psychological exercise.
Yes, the premeditatio malorum.
Which translates to the premeditation of evils. What does this exercise actually entail?
Seneca suggested that every single morning before you engage with the world, you should take a quiet moment to deliberately meditate on disaster. You should literally instruct yourself everything around us is condemned to die. Today, I could lose my fortune. I could be exiled. My reputation could be destroyed. The people I love most could perish. He wanted you to vividly imagine the architecture of your life collapsing.
I can hear people listening to this and thinking, that sounds like a recipe for clinical depression. Waking up and intentionally visualizing the destruction of everything I love. How is this comforting?
It sounds counterintuitive, but the purpose of the exercise is not to induce despair. Its purpose is to act as an emotional shock absorber.
A shock absorber?
By visualizing the worst-case scenario while you are still safe, you process the initial panic and fear in a controlled environment. You mentally rehearse your survival. Then, when a relatively minor frustration actually occurs in your day, like your flight getting canceled or a client rejecting your proposal, you don't scream at the gate agent or punch a wall.
Because you compare the current frustration to the baseline of total disaster you established that morning.
Exactly. They think, well, the plane didn't crash, I'm not facing political exile, and my family is still breathing. A delayed flight is highly manageable. It calibrates your reaction to reality.
To further explain our relationship to fate, Seneca utilized a very vivid, arresting metaphor originally developed by earlier Stoic thinkers like Zeno and Crispus, the metaphor of the dog and the cart. Let's break this down.
Imagine a dog tied to the back of a moving cart with a sturdy leash. The cart represents the undeniable, unstoppable momentum of reality, fate, and the turning of Fortuna's wheel. It is moving, and you cannot stop it. The dog, representing the human being, has two distinct choices.
Choice number one.
The first choice is to recognize the direction the cart is moving and trot alongside it. The dog can enjoy the exercise, take in the scenery, and explore the path within the radius of the leash. It accepts its reality.
And what is the second choice? The dog decides it doesn't want to go in that direction. It braces its legs, digs its paws deep into the dirt, and furiously resists the movement of the cart.
But the cart does not care. The cart does not stop. The cart continues to move forward, dragging the resisting dog through the mud, scraping its paws while the leash slowly chokes it. The destination for both dogs is the exact same. The cart arrives where it is going.
But the dog that trotted alongside arrives exhausted but healthy, while the dog that resisted arrives battered, choked, and miserable.
Seneca is telling us that true freedom isn't the magical ability to control the cart of reality. Freedom is the wisdom to realize what is inevitable and the choice to trot alongside it rather than being dragged.
This specific mindset leads directly to a crucial Stoic concept regarding material possessions and our external circumstances. The concept of the productum, or the preferred indifferent. It is a misconception that a Stoic philosopher must live in abject poverty.
Absolutely. Seneca himself was one of the wealthiest men in Rome, but he viewed his immense wealth strictly as a productum. It is naturally preferred to live in a warm, comfortable villa rather than sleeping on the cold streets. It is preferred to have two functioning eyes rather than being blind.
Naturally.
However, the Stoic realizes that these preferred things are not necessities for maintaining a virtuous, rational, and happy mind. They are temporary loans from Fortuna.
So if Fortuna steers the rudder, and a fire burns Seneca's luxurious villa to the ground, he doesn't suffer a mental breakdown.
Exactly. He doesn't lose his temper because he never attached his core identity or his internal peace to the villa in the first place. He recognizes that the house was always subject to the laws of reality. Wood burns. He adapts. If he loses an eye to illness, he adapts. He accepts the new reality of the cart and continues to trot.
So bringing this directly back to you, the listener, how do you apply Seneca's dog and cart metaphor to the acute anxieties in your own life? Let's say you are lying awake at 3 in the morning, agonizing over rumors of a massive layoff at your company. Or perhaps you are waiting on the results of a concerning medical test.
Seneca says you must stop fighting the hypothetical cart. You must engage in the premeditatio malorum. Look that specific fear directly in the eye. Imagine that the exact thing you fear has already happened. The email arrives. You lost the job. The doctor calls. The test is positive.
Now what? You play the tape forward. You realize that you still possess your rational mind, your internal resilience, and your ability to strategize a new path forward. You realize that while it will be incredibly difficult, you can and will survive it.
By visualizing the worst, you strip the anxiety of its paralyzing unknown terror. You prepare yourself to trot alongside whatever reality arrives. It is a supremely powerful method for neutralizing the paralyzing grip of the unknown. By mentally enduring the disaster before it strikes, we uncover our own latent capacity for endurance.
So what does this all mean for how we view ourselves? Because if the world is frustrating, sometimes the most frustrating thing of all is our own sense of inadequacy.
It's true.
We look in the mirror, we sit in a boardroom, and we feel like we aren't smart enough, cultured enough, or even physically put together enough to belong. To cure this imposter syndrome, we turn to Michel de Montaigne. Enter Montaigne and the consolation for inadequacy.
Michel de Montaigne is, without a doubt, one of the most delightful, humane, and radically honest thinkers of the 16th century. He was a French nobleman who, after a brief career in public life, essentially retired to his family chateau to read, reflect, and invent a new form of writing the essay.
And he famously painted quotes from classical antiquity on the wooden ceiling beams of his circular library so he could look up and be reminded of his philosophical touchstones. One of his absolute favorites was a quote from Pliny the Elder. "There is nothing more wretched or arrogant than man."
That quote perfectly sets the stage for his entire philosophical project. Montaigne spent his career actively rebelling against the staggering intellectual arrogance of earlier philosophers, particularly figures like the Roman statesman Cicero.
Cicero and his intellectual descendants practically worshipped human reason.
The classical and Renaissance view was that our capacity for rational thought elevated us far above the animal kingdom, placing us closer to the angels. Reason was viewed as a divine spark that was supposed to exert perfect control over our base biological instincts. We were supposed to be beings of pure intellect.
But Montaigne looked critically at actual human behavior and found this idea laughable. He pointed out that if we observe the animal kingdom impartially, animals actually seem to navigate existence with far more wisdom than we do.
They do. Animals know instinctively how to self-medicate. They seek out specific plants when they are ill without needing centuries of medical theory. They love simply, honestly, and without neurotic complications.
Whereas humans take this supposedly divine gift of reason and utilize it to invent complex forms of greed, terrifying superstitions, paralyzing anxiety about the afterlife, and endless, exhausting social gossip.
Montaigne's ultimate goal was to aggressively bring us back down to earth, to force us to accept and even embrace our flawed, messy humanity. The text divides his analysis of our perceived inadequacies into three specific categories. Let's start with the most visceral one.
Sexual and bodily inadequacy. How did a 16th century nobleman address this?
With a level of candor that remains shocking even today, Montaigne broke every rule of dignified philosophical writing by documenting his own physical frailties in excruciating detail. He wrote openly about his struggles with kidney stones. He documented his specific dietary habits and his bowel movements.
And perhaps most famously, he wrote entire passages detailing his experiences with temporary impotence, describing how his own reproductive organs frequently behaved with a rebellious mind of their own, embarrassing him at the most inopportune moments.
It is genuinely incredible to read. You have this highly educated, respected aristocrat writing formal essays about how his penis refuses to obey his rational commands. But he wasn't doing this for shock value or crude humor. He had a deeply serious philosophical objective.
His objective was to dismantle the toxic shame that arises from inhabiting a physical body. Montaigne believed that humanity is engaged in a civil war against its own biological form.
Because we have been taught to idolize pure reason, we pretend that we are ethereal beings of light. Consequently, we are mortified whenever our bodies inevitably remind us that we are actually biological, digesting, deteriorating creatures. We feel inadequate when our bodies fail to perform perfectly, whether it is an illness, a lack of physical coordination, or sexual dysfunction.
By putting his own most embarrassing physical realities on paper, Montaigne was performing an act of radical solidarity. He famously reminded his readers that even the most exalted, terrifying kings and the most brilliant, revered philosophers still have to sit on a toilet and defecate.
They are bound by the exact same humiliating biological imperatives as the lowliest peasant. He was telling his readers to stop hating themselves for being human. Stop feeling inadequate because your physical form does not perfectly obey the dictates of your mind. Biological rebellion happens to all of us. It is the baseline condition of existence.
From the intimacy of our bodies, he then broadened his scope to examine the inadequacies we feel regarding our societies. This leads to the second category, cultural inadequacy. Montaigne lived during the Age of Discovery, a time when European global exploration was rapidly expanding.
Returning ships were bringing back accounts of radically different cultures in the Americas and beyond. The default reflexive European reaction to these new societies was intense ethnocentrism. If a newly discovered society didn't organize its politics, its religion, or its clothing exactly the way the French or the Spanish did, the Europeans automatically labeled them as barbaric or abnormal.
The European way of life was considered the absolute objective pinnacle of human civilization. But Montaigne, who traveled extensively throughout Europe and read voraciously about the New World, recognized that this sense of cultural superiority was an illusion. What is normal is largely just an accident of geography and habit.
He delighted in compiling examples of how societal norms wildly contradicted each other. He noted that in the Swiss city of Basel, it was considered entirely normal to drink wine without watering it down, a practice the French considered unrefined. He read accounts detailing how in Mexico, women possessed breasts large enough that they could simply throw them over their shoulders to feed infants strapped to their backs.
He studied reports of the Tupi people of South America, noting that they moved their entire village settlements every 6 months simply for a change of scenery, and that they routinely lived to be 100 years old without their hair turning gray.
Now, we need to add an important impartiality note here, based strictly on the text we are analyzing. The text details how Montaigne utilized these cultural comparisons to launch a devastating historical critique of the Spanish colonists in the New World.
According to Montaigne's analysis, These colonists slaughtered indigenous populations largely because the natives did not wear European-style clothing, meaning pants, and did not adhere to European societal or religious norms.
The colonists justified their brutality by viewing the natives as lesser, almost animalistic beings, simply because their cultural practices were different. We are neutrally importing Montaigne's historical critique here, not endorsing a political side. We are reporting how Montaigne used these horrific historical events to highlight the lethal, blinding arrogance of assuming your own specific culture's way of life is the absolute, unquestionable standard for humanity.
Montaigne's overarching philosophical point regarding culture is twofold. First, we should never feel culturally inadequate simply because our personal habits or local customs differ from the dominant paradigm. Second, and more importantly, we must never inflict cultural superiority on others. We should use our reason to evaluate practices impartially based on their actual merit and kindness, rather than blindly justifying the customs of our homeland while condemning everything unfamiliar as barbaric.
This critical evaluation of what we value brings us directly to his third category, intellectual inadequacy. This is perhaps where Montaigne is most comforting to the modern listener. He drew a massive, crucial distinction between merely possessing rote knowledge and possessing actual wisdom.
This is a distinction that our modern education systems, heavily focused on standardized testing and memorization, still deeply struggle with. Montaigne argued fiercely that the ultimate goal of an education should not be to make a student learned, which he defined as merely cramming a head full of historical dates, abstract theories, and Latin conjugations.
The true goal of education should be to make a student good and wise. He posed a simple test. What is the practical value of knowing the exact phrasing of Aristotle's ethics or understanding the complexities of formal logic if you are still throwing childish temper tantrums when you don't get your way, or if you treat your family and friends with cruelty?
A peasant who has never read a book but who navigates his life with kindness and steady emotional regulation is functionally wiser than an emotionally volatile scholar.
He also directed his critique at the way intellectuals communicated. He was deeply suspicious of obscure, overly complex academic writing.
Dense jargon.
Yes. He believed that if an idea holds genuine practical value for human life, it can and should be expressed clearly. He argued that dense, impenetrable jargon is very often not a sign of high intellect, but rather a shield for intellectual laziness, or a smokescreen designed to cover up a fundamental lack of original thought. Writing simply and clearly requires immense courage, because by removing the confusing jargon, you expose your raw ideas to immediate understanding and potential criticism.
If a philosopher hides behind massive, obscure words, the audience might assume the philosopher is profound simply because the audience feels too intellectually inadequate to admit they don't understand the text. Montaigne refused to play that game.
He valued genuine human connection above all else, and he found the absolute pinnacle of this connection in his deeply intense friendship with the writer Etienne de la Boétie.
How did Montaigne characterize this relationship?
He described their true friendship as a conspiracy against the normal.
A conspiracy against the normal. That is a stunning way to describe intimacy. What does it actually mean in practice?
It means that the vast majority of our lives are spent performing. We perform competency at work. We perform cultural conformity in public. We perform emotional stability for acquaintances. But in a true friendship, the performance ceases. You do not have to pretend to be a creature of pure reason. You do not have to hide your embarrassing bodily ailments, your cultural confusion, or your intellectual blind spots.
La Boétie provided Montaigne with the ultimate psychological safety to simply exist as his flawed, embodied, uncertain self, and to be entirely understood and loved anyway. It was a private rebellion against the exhausting demands of societal normalcy.
So to you, the learner listening right now, if you're sitting there feeling intellectually inadequate because you haven't read every classic novel or you don't really grasp the nuances of quantum physics or complex philosophy, Montaigne is reaching out across the centuries to comfort you.
You do not need to quote Aristotle to understand the mechanics of anger, jealousy, or joy. You just need to honestly, quietly reflect on your own last temper tantrum or your last moment of genuine connection. You possess a massive wealth of primary data inside your own daily experiences. As Montaigne beautifully stated, even Caesar's life is no more exemplary than our own. You are richer in experience than you think.
It is a profoundly democratic, comforting view of human wisdom. But what happens when that true friendship or romance falls apart? That brings us to our most delightfully depressing guide, Arthur Schopenhauer. Let's talk about the consolation for a broken heart.
Arthur Schopenhauer. Born in Danzig in 1788, he is the ultimate pessimist who said, human existence must be a kind of mistake. He viewed the entirety of human life as a relentless, swinging pendulum, oscillating endlessly between the agony of pain when we desire something and the suffocating boredom we feel the moment we actually attain it.
And his personal life certainly reflected, and perhaps heavily influenced, that profound gloom. Despite possessing what was undeniably a towering, generation-defining genius, he was wildly unpopular during his prime working years. The text highlights his academic career at the University of Berlin, which was a spectacular failure of ego.
He deliberately scheduled his philosophy lectures at the exact same time as his massive academic rival, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel.
Hegel was the undisputed academic superstar of the era. His philosophy, which suggested a grand, rational progression of history, was incredibly popular and uplifting. Schopenhauer's philosophy was bleak and deterministic, the result of this scheduling stunt. Hegel routinely had 300 students packed into his lecture hall, hanging on his every word, while Schopenhauer lectured to an empty room of exactly 5 people.
5 people. And furthermore, he was constantly, painfully rejected by the women he pursued. He became increasingly isolated and bitter, eventually withdrawing from human society and declaring that he preferred the company of his pet poodles to the company of human beings.
But out of this intense furnace of personal misery and isolation, he forged one of the most fascinating predictive psychological theories in history. The concept of the will to life, or yaşam iradesi, as it is noted in the Turkish translation of the text.
What exactly is this force?
The will to life is the absolute foundational core of Schopenhauer's entire philosophical system. He argued that beneath the thin veneer of our rational, conscious minds, beneath all our poetry, our complex logic, our career plans, and our moral codes, there operates a massive, blind, unconscious, and relentless biological drive. This drive is the will to life, and it possesses only 2 singular goals: to survive and to reproduce the species.
Schopenhauer posited a terrifying idea. This blind will completely hijacks our rational faculties. We walk around believing we are making conscious, logical, autonomous choices, especially regarding who we love and who we partner with, but in reality we are nothing more than biological puppets dancing on the strings of this evolutionary imperative.
And this theory attempts to explain the eternal, agonizing mystery of human romance. Why this specific person? Why do we so frequently fall madly, obsessively in love with someone who is objectively terrible for us? Someone who makes us miserable, who doesn't share our values, while we completely ignore the perfectly nice, stable, rational person who would actually make a good life partner.
Schopenhauer's theory of attraction bypasses our conscious preferences entirely. It says attraction is solely about balancing the species. The will to life evaluates a potential mate purely on their genetic potential to balance out our own physical and psychological flaws in order to create perfect, symmetrical offspring.
It is a startlingly modern evolutionary perspective.
Yeah.
If, for example, you possess a very large, prominent nose, the will to life seeking physical equilibrium in the next generation might compel you to fall overwhelmingly, irrationally in love with someone who has a tiny button nose. The biological algorithm is actively trying to average out the features.
The crucial point is that the will does not care about your personal happiness. It does not care if the person with the button nose is cruel, emotionally unavailable, or fundamentally incompatible with you on every intellectual level. It only cares about the physical blueprint required for the next generation.
So the grand depressing punchline to this biological joke is that the person who is genetically perfect for the survival and balance of the species is very often psychologically disastrous for us as individuals. We are drawn to them by an irresistible chemical force. We marry them. We fulfill the biological imperative by having the child, and then the chemical fog lifts, and we wake up next to a stranger we can barely tolerate. As Schopenhauer so grimly noted, the next generation is created at the expense of the present.
He even extended this logic to the immediate physical aftermath of romance. Schopenhauer actually argued that postcoital sadness, that sudden unexplained drop in mood, that fleeting feeling of emptiness or melancholy that frequently occurs immediately after physical intimacy, is empirical, observable proof of his theory.
In his view, that sadness is the exact moment the will to life, having either accomplished its goal of reproduction or simulated the accomplishment of its goal, abruptly switches off and abandons us. The chemical curtain drops, the intense illusion of eternal transcendent romantic bliss shatters, and we are suddenly left with our stark, rational minds staring at the reality of our situation and the person next to us.
It is an incredibly bleak assessment of human love, but the critical question is, how does this actually help a broken heart? If you are listening to this right now and you are reeling from a fresh, painful rejection, how does a grumpy 19th century determinist offer any real consolation?
He offers it through the mechanism of total depersonalization. When you ask someone out or you propose a deeper commitment and they reject you, your immediate agonizing thought is internalized. You think, I am unlovable, I'm not attractive enough, not smart enough, not wealthy enough, I am fundamentally flawed.
But Schopenhauer steps in and says, absolutely not. You must stop internalizing this. This rejection is not a personal failing on your part whatsoever. It is simply nature's blind algorithm running its course. The other person's internal will to life performed a rapid subconscious calculation and determined that your specific DNA combined with their specific DNA would not produce the most optimally balanced offspring for the continuation of the species.
That is the entirety of the transaction.
Yeah.
It has absolutely nothing to do with your intrinsic worth as a human being, your sense of humor, your kindness, or your professional success. You are simply a mismatched piece in a grand biological puzzle that you do not control. Understanding this mechanism fundamentally shifts the pain. It takes the agonizing personal sting out of the rejection. You were not judged and found wanting. You were simply biologically incompatible for a specific evolutionary goal.
And if that splash of biological cold water isn't quite enough to cure the heartache, Schopenhauer offers a second, much more elevated and perhaps more comforting consolation, the consolation of art. When we are suffering the acute agony of a broken heart, our primary sensation is one of total isolation. We feel entirely alone. We feel like no one in the long history of the world has ever felt this specific, searing pain. We are trapped inside the claustrophobia of our own suffering, but Schopenhauer insists that in these moments we must turn to tragic literature and art.
The text specifically highlights Goethe's famous novel, The Sorrows of Young Werther, which tells the story of a young man driven to despair and ultimately suicide by unrequited love. Why would Schopenhauer tell a heartbroken person to read a profoundly depressing book? Because by reading a tragic story about unrequited love, we see our own private, isolating pain reflected back to us in a grand, universal context.
We realize that this agony is not a unique curse inflicted upon us alone. It is a fundamental, inescapable part of the human condition. Art takes our subjective, chaotic suffering and transforms it into objective knowledge. When we read Goethe, we step outside the narrow confines of ourselves. We stop being merely sufferers who are blindly trapped in our own misery, and we are elevated to the status of knowers observers who can look down at the grand, tragic, beautiful sweep of human existence with understanding and compassion.
Schopenhauer tells us to find comfort in a pessimistic retreat in art. But our final philosopher looked at Schopenhauer's retreat and called it cowardice. Let's talk about Nietzsche.
Let's delve into the consolation for difficulties. Friedrich Nietzsche provides a fascinating pivot here. In his youth, he was actually a massive, devoted fan of Schopenhauer. He read his works deeply and largely agreed with the pessimistic worldview that life was a miserable affair to be endured. But in 1876, while looking out over the Bay of Naples, Nietzsche experienced a profound, sudden philosophical epiphany that altered the course of his thinking.
He realized that avoiding pain was a mistake. He realized that Schopenhauer's ultimate advice, to minimize pain, to hide from the world, to construct a psychological fireproof room to avoid the struggles of life, was fundamentally dangerously wrong. He realized that avoiding pain inherently meant avoiding greatness.
He formulated the belief that pain and joy, difficulty and achievement are inextricably biologically linked. They are an absolute package deal. You cannot selectively experience the highest, most exhilarating peaks of human achievement, creation, and happiness without being willing to endure the agonizing, grueling, terrifying climbs required to reach them. As he vividly put it in his writings, philosophy is living voluntarily on ice-covered mountains. He despised the idea of a safe, lukewarm existence. You simply do not get the transcendent view from the summit without risking the frostbite.
To illustrate this essential relationship between suffering and growth, Nietzsche utilized the powerful metaphor of a tree in a forest. If you desire a tree to grow incredibly tall, to develop a thick, proud trunk and deep, unshakable roots, you cannot plant it in a perfectly controlled, artificially temperate greenhouse where it is protected from every breeze. It must be planted outside, where it must endure violent storms, harsh freezing winds, and terrible weather. The resistance of the harsh wind is exactly what forces the roots to dig deeper into the soil for stability. The physical damage of the storm is exactly what forces the trunk to grow thicker and stronger. Without the suffering inflicted by the environment, there is no structural strength. In human terms, Nietzsche argued that you cannot write a soaring literary masterpiece like Stendhal's The Red and the Black, or compose a world-changing symphony, or build a massive enterprise without having your heart broken, your endurance tested, and your soul subjected to intense pressure.
This philosophy leads directly to what we can call Nietzsche's critique of comfort. Because he viewed pain as the necessary, indispensable fuel for human greatness, he had a deep, visceral disdain for anything, any substance, any ideology, any religion that attempted to numb human pain or convince people that suffering was purely evil. And the text outlines two primary culprits in 19th century European society that he believed were actively sapping humanity's drive to achieve greatness: alcohol and Christianity.
We must approach this specific critique carefully and impartially, reporting exactly what the text outlines regarding Nietzsche's specific philosophical framework, without endorsing or condemning his views. According to the text, Nietzsche despised alcohol because it chemically numbs our dissatisfaction. Let's say you are deeply miserable in your career. In Nietzsche's view, that misery is a vital biological signal. It is an alarm bell telling you that you need to take a massive risk, quit the job, and change your life. But if instead of listening to the alarm, you go to the pub every single night and drink away the misery until you feel artificially content, you have successfully numbed the signal. The pain goes away temporarily, but you stay stuck in mediocrity forever. You trade your potential for a chemical comfort.
And regarding his critique of Christianity, he viewed it strictly within his philosophical framework as a psychological comfort religion. Again, this is an impartiality note. We are neutrally explaining Nietzsche's concept of what he calls slave morality, as laid out in the text. We are exploring his psychological diagnosis of the religion, not endorsing it.
According to Nietzsche's historical and psychological analysis, this slave morality was invented by powerless, subjugated people within the brutal hierarchy of the Roman Empire. Because these early populations were physically and politically too weak to attain worldly power, wealth, sexual conquest, or societal success, they experienced immense psychological pain and resentment. To cure this pain, Nietzsche argued, they performed a massive psychological rebranding. They took their enforced weakness and rebranded it as a deliberate moral virtue. They were incapable of getting revenge on their oppressors, so they called their impotence forgiveness. They were economically impoverished, so they called poverty blessed. They couldn't achieve power in this life, so they invented a story where the meek would inherit a magical next life. Nietzsche believed this comfort religion was deeply dangerous because it taught people to be passive, to accept their suffering as a virtue, rather than using that suffering as a violent catalyst to fight for greatness, power, and joy in this actual physical world.
It's also incredibly important to add a historical correction here regarding Nietzsche's legacy. His concept of striving for greatness, of overcoming oneself to become the Übermensch or overmen, was horribly intentionally distorted after his mental collapse and subsequent death. His sister, Elizabeth Förster Nietzsche, whom he personally and deeply detested, was a virulent anti-Semitic nationalist. She took control of his unpublished writings, selectively edited them, and manipulated them to align with early Nazi ideology of racial superiority and state worship that Nietzsche himself would have absolutely abhorred. His vision of the Übermensch was never about racial or political domination over others. It was strictly about internal psychological self-mastery, the overcoming of one's own fears, and the pursuit of artistic and intellectual creation.
That is a vital distinction. And to see what Nietzsche actually valued, to understand what he considered a successful human life, we just have to look at his personal role models. He did not idolize military tyrants or brutal dictators. He idolized individuals who embraced the absolute terrifying totality of life, both the immense crushing suffering and the ecstatic transcendent joy. The text points out that he looked up to the writer Goethe, our old friend Montaigne, and the Italian diplomat Ferdinando Galiani. These were not ascetics or monks hiding in caves to protect their purity. They were robust men who took on massive political and social responsibilities. They wrote daring books, they engaged in complex, messy, and painful love lives, they traveled the world, and they danced. They didn't seek a safe, pain-free existence, they actively sought a full existence, accepting the agony as the price of admission for the ecstasy.
Nietzsche warns us that if we constantly, obsessively seek to eradicate our pain through drugs, through passive ideologies, through avoiding risk, we inadvertently, prominently eradicate our potential for joy. He uses a brilliant, simple analogy. If you rush to the dentist to pull a tooth the very second it starts to ache, you rid yourself of the pain, yes, but you also rob yourself of the opportunity to develop the endurance, the fortitude, and the resilience required to achieve anything truly meaningful in the future.
So learner, consider this application directly to your life. When you face a massive hurdle, don't try to numb it. Remember Nietzsche's warning. Pulling a tooth the second it hurts robs you of the endurance required for greatness. Are you secretly pretending you don't want success just because it's hard to get? Do not pull the tooth. Use the pain. Let the resistance of the storm force your roots to grow deeper. This raises an important question. How do we synthesize all these voices?
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We have traveled through thousands of years of thought, dealing with the anxiety of unpopularity, the stress of poverty, the explosion of frustration, the quiet shame of inadequacy, the devastation of heartbreak, and the immense, heavy difficulty of living fully.
It functions as a brilliant, multifaceted symphony of consolation. Socrates gives us intellectual independence. Epicurus redefines our actual needs. Seneca prepares us for the worst through the premeditatio malorum. Montaigne grounds us in our messy humanity. Schopenhauer depersonalizes our heartbreak. And Nietzsche challenges us to use our pain as fuel. They teach us that our suffering is not a sign that we are somehow doing life wrong. Suffering is the very fabric of the human experience.
If these 6 philosophers were dropped into our modern, hyper-connected, AI-driven world, would they see our endless distraction apps as the ultimate comfort religion Nietzsche warned about? Are algorithms the ultimate herd that Socrates would tell us to question? It is something to think about the next time you reflexively unlock your phone to avoid a moment of difficult silence. Don't forget to follow us and subscribe to stay updated on our latest episodes and never miss a step in this odyssey of thought. Until next time, keep questioning.